Now, what has been how have we managed all of this? Well, they were already in the Treaty of Maastricht that enacted the Economic and Monetary Union. There was a design, something that probably none of you have ever heard of, speaks in the treaty about broad economic policy guidelines. I doubt if more than 2 or 3 of you have ever heard this expression. Yet, this is the article in the treaty that describes the instrument available for economic coordination in Europe. Well, you have never heard of it because, in a sense, it's not used. And the one time that it was really used in a forceful manner was misused. And therefore, it's essentially playing no role at all at the moment. Well, we all know that there is the Stability and Growth Pact, which is supposed to coordinate, in a sense, fiscal policies. And broad economic policy guidelines and the Stability and Growth Pact, they are instruments that you could describe as being instruments to prevent, at least among the countries in the euro area, to prevent crisis, to prevent, let's say, fiscal crisis, or to prevent certain divergences among the countries that would create problems for the single currency. Given that we have a single currency, we would not like to have too much divergences among the countries. If you look at the crisis today, one can say that one has been very successful. Certainly, there are a huge amount of divergences among our economy and among our various economies. And in that sense, you can say that the system of coordination has worked very well before we reached the crisis. In a sense, the crisis prevention did not work very well. Well, we have also tried to coordinate for other purpose than crisis prevention. This has been about the famous Lisbon Agenda that was launched in 2000, that is now being renamed Europe 2020. I suppose one needed a new name since the first one did not work so well. It was better to move to a second name, and one hopes that it will be better than simply changing the name, that one will also change the governance of the system. But we know that the Lisbon Agenda has not really delivered as much as it had promised. So those different instruments of coordination that we had before the crisis, I think they've been helpful some, but certainly they have not delivered as much as one had hoped. The question that I want to ask is, when the crisis started, one also needed certain kind of coordination, but the fact of the matter is that in reality, in the treaty, there was no mechanism foreseen for crisis management. And the question, therefore, that I want to look at, how well did we do? Now, I just want to recall that in January 2008, in a sense before the crisis, or before the crisis really became a major crisis, with a few colleagues at Bruegel, we wrote a report. It was, in a sense, the first report on those various reports written for the 10th anniversary of the euro. We wrote it it was sort of during the 9th year, and we had only 8 years behind us then. And we tried to make an assessment of how well the euro has worked. And those are quotations from the report, we said, well, the euro has worked well, but we said, let's be careful. The 8 years so far have been fair weather years. The conditions have been rather favorable. And he said, we still need to see what would happen if we were to face stormy conditions. And the view was that, in a sense, the policy framework, as we were there in January 2008, the policy framework of the euro area had not yet been tested. It had not been tested under stress. It had been, as I said, rather benign years. And we concluded by saying it remains to be seen how well EMU, how well Economic and Monetary Union, is set up to deal with events like disruptive global shocks or internal crisis. Little did we know that a few months later, indeed, we were going to face a major global crisis. So in a sense, I think I'm entitled now to look, having, with my colleagues, having said, let's be careful before we cheer too much. I think I'm entitled now to look at what has happened. Well, let me just give, this is going to be the only numbers I'm going to give you. This is about GDP growth in the euro area compared to advanced economies. And this is coming from the WEO, from the World Economic Outlook, the IMF's report in October 2009. So those numbers are already a couple of months old, and they're changing all the time. But, I mean, they're giving a fair situation. And I'm also comparing here the new member states, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, to emerging and developing countries. Now, you have there the number for the world, you have the number for the European Union. I think what is very striking is that if you look at the period immediately before the crisis, 2007, 2008, the euro area was doing just as well as the advanced economies of the world, including the US and Japan, essentially the OECD in general. We were doing just on the average. If you look at 2009, we are doing worse than the average. We are doing worse than the advanced country as a whole, minus 3.4. I mean, we shall see exactly where we'll be in 2009, but the forecast is generally somewhere a bit minus 4% or a little bit higher than that. If you look at the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, where I suppose many of us before the crisis, maybe not the most astute ones, but many of us would have thought that those countries, they're inside the European Union, the new member states, they would benefit from being inside the European Union, they would be hit less bad. Turns out that they've been hit much worse than the emerging and developing countries as a whole. While we know China, what has happened in general to Asia developing countries, their growth has continued in a positive manner. In fact, Central and Eastern Europe, the new member states have been hit even worse than the euro area. And if you look at the forecast, again, those are the October forecasts for 2010, you see that the situation, there is recovery in the euro area, and we know that recovery has started, maybe a bit later in Spain than in the rest of the euro area, but recovery has started. But the general feeling is that recovery is proceeding at a slow pace. Now, some believe that there is a relationship between those figures that I've just given you, the relatively poor performance of the euro area, but also the new member states of the EU in general, and its governance system. I remember an article that Paul Krugman wrote, actually probably during his visit to Spain in March of this year. He wrote an article in the New York Times entitled "A Continent Adrift." And he was asking himself, why is Europe doing poorly? And his view, as you can say, he says, and I'm quoting here, but there is a deeper problem in Europe than poor leadership. Europe's economic and monetary integration has run too far ahead of its political institutions. The economies of Europe's many nations are almost as tightly linked as the economies of America's many states. And most of Europe shares a common currency. But unlike America, Europe doesn't have the kind of continent-wide institutions needed to deal with a continent-wide crisis. And then a couple of months later, Marek Belka, who is a former finance minister and a former prime minister of Poland, and who is now the director of the European department at the IMF, who, by the way, was also one of the co-authors of the report, Bruegel report that I mentioned before. He wrote, Europe is the most economically integrated market economy in the world, and yet the policies to address the crisis have been undertaken at the national level. Without a well-coordinated effort in these areas, neither fiscal nor monetary policy efforts will work as effectively as they must to make sure that Europe is as vibrant and prosperous after the crisis as it was before. Europe is facing the economic storm of a lifetime, and it urgently needs to weatherproof its institutions. So those were views expressed, let's say, by Paul Krugman, by the IMF, saying essentially Europe is facing a problem of poor governance, and unless it manages to tackle the problems of its poor governance, problems could prove to be very, very difficult.